It's always great. It's always heartwarming. It's always humbling to be able to speak about Israel-Palestine, because it is such a big issue for so many. It is so important. And yet, it's one that does not, in a way, get enough meaningful conversation, meaningful discussion, analysis. And so for today, I wanted to share something that is very close to where my current thinking is about Israel-Palestine. It is at the heart of what ails the world, I think. And that's what I want to put out. Tonight's talk is based on one that I developed earlier this year and gave about a dozen times in different venues, different circumstances in Minnesota and on Vancouver Island. I revised it for tonight because this audience, Beit Zatoun audience, is more informed than most, having been educated by hundreds of Beit Zatoun events over the years. Over the years about Palestine, global justice, indigenous struggles, neoliberalism, exploitation, etc. In this talk, I set out to connect Palestine with the planet because I am concerned and frustrated at what I am seeing in the activist and grassroots world. People, especially young people on the campuses, have become focused almost exclusively on global warming and climate change and are losing interest in the more political struggles, such as Palestine and other political global issues. I want to be clear, this is not to understate the danger of global warming. There is no question that it is the greatest issue facing humanity today. But it also needs to be understood and approached in a larger context of global politics and power. However much we try, it will not be resolved. Global warming, the ecology, the problems will not be resolved by more solar panels, electric cars, or wind turbines. These are tools, but they are not solutions. They will ultimately fail because what is missing is an appreciation of the greater context and infrastructure needed to solve the crisis of the physical planet. So this talk puts Palestine at the center of the discussion only because I think it belongs there, and I'd like to share that with you. Palestine is the permanent poster child of international injustice. It is the poster child of failure of international law and the failure of international bodies, such as the United Nations, to act fairly and boldly to bring responsible and mature governance to the world. It is in this way that just peace in Israel-Palestine is indirectly related to the crisis. It is not the cause of the crisis, but it is an important part of the solution. I also want to say that a just peace is not a guarantee of a solution. It's only the best place to begin the process towards resolving global warming. Also, I have to admit the title was a way to grab the attention of the global climate audience. I admit it is a bit of a sensationalist title, How a Just Peace in Israel-Palestine Can Save Our Planet. Think of it as clickbait, but only the honest kind. I have every hope that I can deliver on the promise of the title. Perhaps I could have added one tiny big word, help, as in how a just peace in Israel-Palestine can help save our planet. I know that people here tonight understand the centrality of the ongoing problem Israel-Palestine to the political and moral sickness that the world lives in, and that it cannot possibly heal without Israel-Palestine being justly resolved. Most Canadians, of course, do not get that. And my mission in this work has been to get people who cannot grasp the details to at least appreciate the enormity of Israel-Palestine on their lives and begin to pay attention. Before we begin, it is appropriate and necessary to acknowledge that we are standing on Turtle Island and our guests on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit and other indigenous peoples before them. The Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, and the Seneca First Nations. But we cannot stop at that. We further acknowledge that indigenous peoples on this land have been treated unjustly and suffered a continuous colonialist project. We oppose the racist situation or the racist government policies and public attitudes which maintain this inhuman situation and repeat it every day. We demand a process of honest truth and true reconciliation beginning with restoration based on recognizing the land rights and human rights of Turtle Island's indigenous peoples. The acknowledgement in its fullest justice expression is particularly relevant for Palestine because it too is a victim of a settler colonial project only 400 years later. Israel-Palestine is an odd case because it is something out of its time. Jonathan Kutab, who's spoken at Beit Zatoun a number of times, calls it an anachronism, something which exists outside of its time and place. A colonial project started in the dying days of colonialism, yet here it exists as concrete as ever in the brutalist concrete wall that Israel has built to surround the Palestinians, but also to lock Israelis into a mental prison of their own making. I would like to mention that unlike the land we stand on in Toronto, which is subject to the Toronto Purchase of 1787, also known as Crown Treaty 13, the land of Palestine was never ceded. It has been promised, given, sold, bought, brokered, partitioned, traded, stolen, but it was never ceded by its indigenous peoples, the Palestinians.
Does that mean never ceded?
Ceded means generally that it has been treated. There was a treaty, it was signed, they received something in recognition for it. That's ceded.
Okay.
So in Canada, you have territories that have been ceded in that way, and others where there has been no treaty. So most of British Columbia is not ceded, has not been negotiated away, you could say. But in my opinion, not that ceded changes the reality of dispossession and exploitation. Try negotiating with the Royal Bank on a loan, or Facebook or Google on their end user agreement. What a ridiculous concept. Ceded, treated, negotiated with these juggernauts of power. As with most indigenous struggles, the people and the land, in this case the Palestinians, have cared for their land and made it productive and sustainable for centuries. They revere the olive tree, as we do the maple, but 100-fold more. For Palestinians, the olive tree carries the memory of Palestine, and that is why they weep so deeply when it is uprooted or cut down. And for the exact same reason, Israel continues to destroy olive trees, to extinguish the memory. Many here know me through Beit Zatoun. If you do not, my name is Robert Massoud. I'm a Palestinian Canadian born in Jerusalem. I am from a Christian family, and I'm an Israeli citizen. In 2004, I started Zatoun, fair trade olive oil from Palestine. And Zatoun is the Arabic word for olive. And Zatoun was created to bring to Canadians and Americans a different view of Palestine, to bring a dimension of sense and of experience, a feeling of sharing, of realness, a way to connect them with Palestine so that they would listen differently when they hear the word Israel, Palestine, or Zionism in the media. In 2009, it seemed like a good idea to find a home for Zatoun, but also a home for all liberation struggles and human rights. And so Beit Zatoun, House of Olive, opened its doors in January 2010 as an event space, inviting all communities of Toronto to bring their issues and challenges and share them with others. I've always maintained that no one struggle, especially the Palestinian one, can succeed without friends and solidarity. So I welcome opportunities to speak before supporters and customers, and also people who have never heard before of Zatoun, as it helps further and extend the mission of Zatoun. The fact is for me that Zatoun has become my voice. It allows me to project my voice to people across the country in the United States on the subject of Palestine. It also enables customers and supporters to find their own voice. It gives them a tangible item to hold as they speak to others about a topic, Israel-Palestine, that most people find most difficult. So I'm thankful to Zatoun for connecting me with tens of thousands of people in this meaningful way. Zatoun is my only authority. I represent no one but myself and my views and analysis. I speak of no organization, for no government, or no party. I speak only of my experience of many years working with Zatoun and Beit Zatoun. So for tonight, I want to connect two very critical and related realities, which I do not think have been linked enough or yet, but absolutely need to be, and that is Palestine-Israel and planet Earth. I would like to make the following statement a fact. The planet we call home is in trouble. Human survival depends on strong and determined global action by governments across the world. States act generally according to international law and work within governing structures. And both of these have been lain almost mortally wounded by 70 years of Israel's intransigence and impunity towards Palestinians and occupation of their land, all in stark and repeated violation of international law and governing structures. Then I also want to make the following statement of opinion. And the only way to save human life on the planet is to rescue international law and global governance from impotence and irrelevance. And the best place to begin is a true and just peace in Israel-Palestine. Literally insisting on applying international law and an end to coddling and protecting Israel's actions in world forums will bring back leadership and moral authority to set a healthy agenda for the planet. That is really, in a nutshell, the talk. So my argument rests on recognition of three core realities that we ignore at our own peril. For the way forward, we must live by these three pillars. The principle is justice, the foundation is international law, and the infrastructure is the United Nations. And can we say that those three operate in the world today? I don't think so. But before I get into all of this, like everything else about Israel-Palestine, it requires a huge preamble to set the stage. You could say that's all I've been doing until now is a preamble. My family immigrated to Canada when I was a child, and for the longest time, I felt and I have been colonized by Zionism, but only able to name it in the last few years. What do I mean by colonized? I mean accepting and living with internalized Zionist assumptions, logic, and myths, such as civilized, humane, democratic, moral army, light onto the world, Israel only defends itself, etc. And not to mention the biblical pronouncements of chosen and promised. This has taken a hold of me, is embedded in my bones and in my mind, making it difficult, if not impossible, to stand against Israel. Although much can be said about being colonized, to me it boils down most essentially to feeling inferior, to the point of being not worthy of justice or dignity. Your claim to these two very human essentials just does not rate, so why bother? I can only say that I am on the road to being decolonized, but it is a very long one. And I say this as a Palestinian. I cannot imagine the challenge faced by non-Palestinian Canadians to become conscious of the stranglehold on their minds. People who have not suffered, not witnessed, not connected, but most likely been indoctrinated and acculturated to the Zionist narrative for so long and so completely. How can they be expected to see? All the more reason to honor your presence here tonight. And I want to say a deep thank you. I also want to acknowledge the amazing work and courage of organizations like CJPME, IJV, our friend Murray here, who represented Mohammed Mahjoub against deportation and being held, and I forget the details of the story. The BDS Coalition, the United Church, and individuals like Miriam Garfinkel, who was a great friend of Zatoun and Beit Zatoun, and someone like Dimitri Lascaris, who has done so much and is being attacked so viciously by even the Prime Minister of this country, and dozens and hundreds of others. I feel humble before their efforts and their caring. So please allow me to share with you my personal approach to this terrible situation, that of Israel-Palestine. From Beit Zatoun events, you know that I do not catalog the untold number of violations, the injustices, the crimes, the brutalities of Zionism and Israel. I choose not to do this for a number of reasons. Number one, there's thousands of examples that you could easily be found on the internet. And for this, you've got the orange sheet, for instance, and just go online for 5 minutes and you can see everything you need to see about Israel's violations. Secondly, I find it not useful to bombard you. After 5, 6, 7 examples of violations and crimes, people begin to go blank. They become comatose, their minds are overwhelmed. They shut down and they cannot absorb. It's also an assault on your heart, and it literally pains me to inflict this on people. I feel I am reveling in victimization and using guilt to manipulate. To me, this is most dishonest and repugnant. And fourthly, in cataloging crimes endlessly, true communication is missing. Real learning is limited, and the opportunity for critical perspective is lost. I believe to simply shock people does not accomplish much. The shock wears off and we are back to normal. We live in shocking times. We are more aware thanks to information sources, but the more information, the more we become desensitized and shut down, and the learning goes less deeply. So for these reasons, I'd rather choose to share with you the big picture, the distillation of a lifetime of observing, learning, thinking, for the last 15 years as a full-time activist through my work with Zatoun and Beit Zatoun. I would like to use the analogy of Google Maps. I like Google Maps for the power it gives us to see at many levels to gain perspective. It can zoom down to the street level and the house level. In the case of Israel-Palestine, the violations, the crimes, and the individual incidences. But it can also telescope up to a higher level and see the neighborhood, how the houses relate to each other, how the streets connect, and how the city comes together. We can zoom up to the region, to the province, the city, and finally the planet view. So tonight, I take you to the planet view, because that is what I think is the most valuable thing I can give you today, I can provide today. When we have perspective and overview, you can always find the street level or for yourselves tomorrow. So we come to the core of our talk, how a just peace in Israel-Palestine can save our planet. By the way, about the title, with a show of hands, how many of you agree that with the title, that it can save this planet? That just peace in Israel-Palestine can save the planet?
Oh, yeah.
So,
connected to international law.
well, yes, but then I'll make those points. But basically, half the people here think it can. How many people think it's totally far-fetched and outlandish, and on its own it can't do it? A just peace in Israel-Palestine can't bring. So one person, so there's some doubt. There's some doubt. And that's fair.
Like my titles either.
Okay, you came. That's right. You're interested. It's totally great to be somewhat, skeptical, because it is a big bundle of responsibility for a huge problem. But my job is to lay it out for you in this way. So at this point, I want to squarely and clearly put justice at the center of everything I'm about to say. So remember, we talked about the principle of justice. So the concept of justice is central. In some ways, I would say it is all there is of true value and meaning. And a point that I also want to make is that it is not, Israel-Palestine is not simply about over there, and it's not about them. It is also here, and it's about us. In a connected world, in a globalized world, us and them, there and here, they don't work anymore as dividing concepts. As people and individuals, we generally only focus on narrow range of concerns and priorities and goals. The criteria we normally use is, how does it affect me? It's not a bad criteria. It's only natural. We are individuals. But sometimes what is missing is a second part. How does it affect others? And this is the golden rule that is taught by so many traditions. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. However, by virtue of a shrinking world and a dying planet, we now have a third question we have to ask ourselves. How does it affect the planet? And I sincerely believe that justice is to human rights as to human affairs. Let me start over on that. I sincerely believe that justice is to human affairs and human life as the balance of nature is to the life of the earth as a unified ecosystem. To borrow from the accepted notion of the balance of nature, justice is the balance of humanity. And the two operate on identical principles. Any violation to justice or to the balance of nature begins a slow, relentless, and insidious process, however subtle and benign, of destabilization, followed by adaptation, leading to further destabilization until total collapse. And maybe that's what we're seeing in human life. Certainly Trump is doing his best at it.
Oh, don't be saying that.
Okay, I won't say that. So we'll keep going. If you are moved by the danger to life on this planet, then know that it is inextricably tied to the absence of justice in human affairs. If you wish to save this planet, then seek to establish justice in human affairs. I believe it is not possible to treat them as separate or parallel realities. In the past, activists were content aiming for peace in the world. They would say, if you love justice, then seek peace in Israel-Palestine. I say, with the planet hanging in the balance, that changes to, if you love life, then seek justice in Israel-Palestine. Love justice becomes love life, and seek peace becomes seek justice. So if you take anything away from tonight, it is, if you love life, seek justice in Israel-Palestine. So, to get on with the case for the title, number one, our planet is in trouble, or rather human life on the planet is in trouble. I think that reality is not controversial in itself. What might be controversial is what's the cause and who's to blame, and we're not interested in that topic right now. Given the evidence of floods, food and drinking water shortages, droughts, hurricanes, peak oil, dwindling minerals, scarcity of rare metals, vanishing sand, etc., we need to begin to pay attention and do everything we can to secure the planet. Two, in the real and present danger of global climate, and given the enormity and the scope of the challenge, only a global effort will succeed. Global means that each and all individual nations and states must be on board. There is no opting out. No nation can say, it doesn't affect me, it's not my business. Global action in the modern world is governments or state actors, be they democracies, healthy or failed, dictatorships and despots, corrupt plutocracies, etc. For better or worse, governments work or cooperate to various degrees through world bodies such as the United Nations and its agencies. For instance, education, culture, refugees, climate, disarmament, trade, tariffs, etc. Anything that sabotages or diminishes the United Nations as a body renders it ineffective. Making the United Nations irrelevant is not helping the planet and delaying urgent action and unity. The US in the last 15, 20, even 30 years has severely damaged the United Nations in practice and in theory. It has kept the United Nations on a short leash, dependent, starved, and scared. And arguably it has done this to benefit Israel, to its own detriment and standing in the world. We can ask why, but we cannot answer it here tonight. Suffice is to say, it is a most stupid, short-sighted, and destructive behavior. The present and unjust situation in Israel-Palestine has distorted and damaged the global agenda and the practice of foreign policy and the pursuit of justice everywhere in the world. And this is especially true when we examine US foreign policy in the last 50 years. And related to number three, Governments or state actors operate on international law and conventions developed over hundreds of years. These laws, for better or worse, more or less regulate the interaction of states. Despite failings and shortcomings, international law regulates what states can do and how they do it. And two, also what states cannot do. When international law is ignored, we do so at our peril, the peril of people, of humankind, and the planet. Israel's repeated actions have made a mockery of international and humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. It has made hypocrites and accomplices of the European Union, the United Nations, and the United States, who cannot act boldly or honestly in the world when they turn a blind eye to Israel's violations. And here we come to the clincher. To my mind, and I hope to yours, the situation of Israel-Palestine is the single greatest world divider. I'm borrowing from Bush's decider. This is the divider. Right up there for dividing and bankrupting. It is the massive boulder on the path. It is the giant sinkhole in the road making progress impossible. However Israel will want to blame Palestine, Palestine is not the divider. It is Israel because of the two. It holds the overwhelming power, and Israel has the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Of course, Israel cannot have done this single-handedly. As mentioned before, it has to have willing accomplices among the high and mighty nations, be they willing politicians, pliable dictators, corruptible governments, and powerful lobbies. Let's look at the story told by examining the U.S. vetoes at the United Nations Security Council, the most important international body, at least in theory. The United Nations body charged with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The only world body that can pass binding resolutions and actions. The U.S. is one of the 5 permanent members who can veto any resolution. So any one of the 5 can veto the resolutions. So surprisingly, the United States did not use its veto power until 1970, so 25 years after the United Nations was established. Its first veto was used in March 1970 over South Rhodesia. Interesting. The second U.S. veto came 2 years later to protect Israel from a resolution condemning an attack on one of its neighbors. Since then, the United States has cast a total of 43 vetoes to shield Israel from Security Council resolutions that condemn or denounce it and calls on it to obey international law. Since 1970, the United States has vetoed more resolutions than all the other 4 members combined. 52%. And of these vetoes that it has passed, 55% were to shield Israel. Remarkably, in each one of the Israel vetoes, the United States stood alone in the veto. Not a single other member of the 4 permanent members or the 10 revolving members joined it in the veto. Just goes to show you how focused it is on the United States. So 28% of the vetoes in the past 50 years at the United Nations Security Council, arguably the only place where the world's problems can be solved, were made to shield Israel from compliance with international law, effectively giving Israel a blank check to keep breaking the law. The United States has for 50 years sabotaged its own international standing and moral authority before the world. Of course, people like John Bolton and Nikki Haley and other neocons will somehow call it moral clarity, whatever that is. But I doubt too many people in this room will buy that nonsense. So finally, this is why I say that peace in Israel-Palestine is our best hope. Once achieved, it can launch a process of rebuilding international law and the United Nations in all its bodies and functions for the betterment of the planet. Without the United Nations acting in concert with nations of the world, there is no hope. No one can go it alone. not the United States, not China, not Russia. And don't count on the billionaires to save us. They weren't going to save us either. So, but as you know, peace in Israel-Palestine is easier said than done. It's been the most consistent, non-stop talk of the world for 70 years. Peace in Israel-Palestine is the train that never arrives at the station. Why is that? And we could put up many real reasons and many false excuses. But I believe that until now, the stakes have not been high enough. The planet's survival was not threatened. And international law and the United Nations could continue to be bankrupt. But now that's no longer the case. You could say we could no longer afford the calculation of too much personal effort for too little personal benefit. Now, any effort is for our personal benefit. So I'm standing here today saying it's worth the effort. In fact, it is worth it like nothing else. It is the single greatest big win we can imagine. We're not talking about taking on Russia or taking on China or taking on the United States. We're just saying no. We will not continue to protect Israel in the United Nations General Assembly or the Security Council. We will not continue to reward Israel with $4 billion annually. That's what the United States, at least very visibly, gives them. There's a lot more that is also transferred. We will not continue to consider you our only friend and ally in the Middle East. How many times has Trudeau said that? He says that almost every day. I am saying peace in Israel-Palestine is the ultimate test, the first step to a new lease on international law and United Nations. We are approaching a make or break moment. I do not say that a just peace in Israel-Palestine is a guarantee, just an excellent low-cost place to begin saving the planet. Maybe you're thinking our speaker is a nice guy, very sincere, but really out to lunch. And I can understand your doubts. However, I believe that life begins with imagination. I'm not thinking of Walt Disney or science fiction variety, but of imagination to visualize and seek love and justice in a healthy human planet and human family. Recently I came across an article with the title, "We can imagine the end of the earth before we can imagine the end of capitalism."
Say it again.
We can imagine the end of the earth before we can imagine the end of capitalism.
Speak for yourself.
That's what the title of the article. So I do not want to enter into a discussion of capitalism or economic system, but just to point out how, in my opinion, our world, our behavior, our survival depends or begins with an imagination of something different and something better. So a simple test right now. Take a few seconds to imagine, and I'm sure everyone can in this room, how the world would be a healthier, saner, and more noble place if Israel-Palestine was truly resolved and the deception ended. Can we see that? Imagine how different it would be. So how much pure, positive energy and good would be released into the world to heal and make it whole. Instead, we would instantly move from a black hole, sucking up all the light, to a radiant sun, guiding us to a healthy future. So I want to state again that in my opinion, justice is all we have to save this planet. We have tremendous pressure as individuals, as families, as countries, in healthcare and scarcity, inequality, water and housing, and so on. But what is the common denominator to all of these? What is the one thing that underpins them all? It is, in my opinion, to be and to do justice to fellow, and in the last 30 years, towards the planet. Use justice as your guide to bring a just peace to Israel-Palestine and begin the journey to saving ourselves and future generations. If we cannot appeal for justice out of pure love for the principle and the concept of justice, or for our people not in our circle of loved ones, that's a great term, loved ones, then let us do it out of pure self-interest, expecting that this is our only and best chance for individual survival. our only hope, and this may be our last kick at the can, coming out of World War II, there was a short-lived window to establish a new world order. And I mean new world order in a good way, not the Bush neocon kind of way. That window was smashed, I believe, by the partition plan of Palestine, which passed in November 1947, which revealed how little the exercise of power had changed, and that the United Nations was irrelevant. That window, post-World War II, promised a future where the overriding principles of justice, the foundation of international law, and the United Nations would be the vehicle for a new future. So here we are, 70 years later. We need to return to that vista, that outlook. Life depends on it. The issue, Israel-Palestine, that broke the window back then, 70 years ago, now needs to repair it for all of us. So to conclude the talk, I want to read an excerpt from a long excerpt from a long poem by Maya Angelou, the most iconic American poet of modern times. And she read it for the first time at the 50th anniversary commemoration of the United Nations in 1995. She must have believed that the United Nations was the place, the institution that holds the best chance for survival of humankind on this tiny, beautiful planet. The name of the poem, or the title of the poem, is A Brave and Startling Truth. We, this people, on a small and lonely planet, traveling through casual space, past aloof stars, across the way of indifferent suns, to a destination where all signs tell us it is possible and imperative that we learn a brave and startling truth. And when we come to it, to the day of peacemaking, when we release our fingers from fists of hostility and allow the pure air to cool our palms, we, this people, on the small and drifting planet, whose hands can strike with such abandon that in a twinkling life is sapped from the living. Yet those same hands can touch with such healing and irresistible tenderness, that the haughty neck is happy to bow and the proud back is glad to bend. Out of such chaos, of such contradiction, we learn that we are neither devils nor divines. When we come to it, we, this people, on this wayward floating body, created on this earth, of this earth, have the power to fashion for this earth a climate where every man and every woman can live freely, without sanctimonious pity, without crippling fear. When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible. We are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it. So I want to thank Maya Angelou 23 years later. I believe this is truer by the day. I want to suggest that it, in the poem, is truth. It is justice, and the it begins in Israel-Palestine. I believe that human life, in essence, is relatedness and connection. Tonight, I wanted to connect our future life on this planet with justice and peace, particularly in Israel-Palestine. And I wanted to create a connection for you with Palestine, in the hope that when you hear or read of Palestine or Israel or Zionism, your mind will go back to today, and you will see the impact, the importance, the centrality of why this issue is a make or break issue for the entire planet. So I want to thank you for being here tonight, and I'm very happy to entertain all the questions that you have.